Hey everybody, this is DLL Cool J coming at you from Archcloud Labs, and on this episode of Hey, how do we use Empire, we're going to go ahead and take a look at an example environment where we have a quote-unquote remote Empire server that is going to be our central server that our consultants will connect to, and we're going to play the role of adding a new user to the Empire server so we can have our Star Killer client at 192.168.122.21 connect to our Empire server at 192.168.122.20, and then interact with an already existing session. So we'll already have a agent deployed on our target one, and that's just going to be a vanilla Ubuntu server. So we'll already have that set up. So we'll have the Star Killer client interact with this session to spawn a new session to call back to their own machine. And you might be thinking, okay, what's like a practical use case here? Why would I want to do this? Well, if you're operating in a red team for a consulting company and you have multiple people trying to engage on a product, maybe you have done your side of the job, you've done a bunch of recon, you've gone ahead and gotten that initial access piece, and now it's time to pass it off to someone that may be more familiar with certain technologies or an environment that you're just not used to. Maybe you're more of a Windows person and this is just a heavy Linux environment, vice versa. At the end of the day, what we're going to show here is how you can effectively set up an environment to have multiple end users join an Empire server and how you can enable, disable said access. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the console and walk through a couple scenarios to get our feet wet. Alright, so now we're at the admin panel of our main Empire server. So this is that 192.168.122.20 host that we saw in the previous diagram. And what we're going to do is go ahead and create a new user so that way the most recent employee of Archcloud Labs Consulting, Hacker2, can join the environment and start messing around with existing agents and actually spawn their own agent to call back to their server, which is just going to be at 192.168.122.21 as shown in the diagram. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and just click into my virtual machine here, and the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and go to the admin submenu. So this is where you want to be to execute any additional admin functionality. And if we go ahead and type help, we can see a bunch of the options that are at our fingertips for this particular Empire server. I'm going to go ahead and scroll up here in my Tmux pane so we can kind of take everything in. So immediately we see some things kind of related to administrative tasks such as adding users, deleting users, enabling users, etc. But also, we can go ahead and do a couple different types of configuration settings, such as deleting a malleable to C2 profile. We could add malleable to C2 profiles, or go ahead and set default obfuscation commands for all future PowerShell commands to be run in the future. So the admin pane has more functionality than just, hey, let me add and disable users. And that's something just to kind of note, because when you hear, oh, the admin pane, I think there's a little bit of an assumption that, oh, I'm just going to add and delete or enable, disable users. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and see the users that are currently added to this Empire server. And to do that, you're going to go ahead and do user list. This is also a really good time to remember that tab is your friend, and there's autocomplete for a bunch of the command line options here. And if you ever don't know what the commands are going to be, just go ahead and do a -H, and you can get a little bit of a help around that given command. So I'm going to go ahead and execute user list. And here we see we have Empire admin, which is going to be your default user, and in that case, that's me. And then we have the test123 user, which is currently enabled. So test123, that doesn't sound like a real person, and it's not. I added this user just to show how you can go about disabling a user. So here we have test123, I don't really know what this is, I don't want this around. Maybe, another Empire administrator was messing around on the server before I got to it. So let's go ahead and do disable user. And again, we're going to do -H and see, okay, we just need to do the user ID. So user ID we're going to get from the column over here, so 2. So I'm going to go ahead and do disable user, 2, suddenly user's disabled. If I go ahead and do user list, boom, no longer enabled. Feeling warm and fuzzy about that, sweet. So with that being said, let's go ahead and create our new user for the latest person to join the Untitled Labs consulting firm that doesn't exist. So with that, we're going to go ahead and do create user, and wonder what I have to type here. So again, that -H, and here we see username, password. So I'm going to go ahead and do create user, hacker2 for a username, and abc123 for a password, and boom, user added. Go ahead and do a user list just to make sure, and sure enough, hacker2 has been added. Note that by default, all new individuals getting added to the user lists are not given admin privileges. That's just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind, is that your Empire admin account by default will be the only account that has the admin privileges. So at this point, if you were focused on, say, like more of like a Windows environment, and you were like, okay, we need to use these specific profiles to for our C2, for a malleable C2, you could go ahead and set those also through loading additional malleable profiles. Or additionally, if you needed to obfuscate all future commands that were PowerShell agents, or excuse me, if you wanted to specify the obfuscate technique for all future PowerShell commands to run on agents, you can do that here. However, given that we're going to be running in a specific Linux environment for today's video, we're not going to worry about any of this. So now that we got that all the way, we've added our user, we're going to go ahead and jump on over to our other client, our brand new user, and have them connect, and then start interacting with the server remotely. So let's go ahead and transition over to our other client. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and play the role of the brand new consultant to Untitled Labs Consulting, Hacker2, and we're going to go ahead and connect to the Empire server with the account that was just created, Hacker2, with a password of abc123, and we're going to start getting situational awareness of what has been going on the server before I go and, badger my senior consultant with a bunch of questions that I can figure out on my own. So let's go ahead and start, and you see here I've already filled out the URL. So again, this is the 192.168.122.21 client connecting to the 192.168.122.20 server by default, and you can specify this to be a different port when you start up your Empire server, but by default the Empire server listens on 1337. And I'm going to go ahead and connect to this now, ABC123, and click submit. And boom, I've connected. We're going to go ahead and see a quick little notification message that currently what I'm using is a slightly older version of Starkiller. So some features may not work properly, but for this given example, that's okay. However, in the real world, when you're doing consulting, you're definitely going to want to make sure these versions match, so that way, you don't run into any kind of nasty hiccup that you didn't expect on an engagement. So with that being said, let's go ahead and click around a little bit and gain situational information about the ongoing engagement, so I know what's going on before I start trying to spawn a new client. So first, I see that we have one default listener on our Empire server. And with that, we see we're listening on port 6443. Interesting, that's the default Kubernetes API port. So maybe we're trying to blend in some kind of weird Linux environment. We're trying to pretend that we're a Kubernetes server talking upstream. Or it's just an arbitrary port number there. Just kind of giving dialogue to what's going on here. Next, let's go ahead and see what stagers, if any, are available. Okay, we don't see any stagers. Maybe there hasn't been any created, or they were previously deleted. That's fine. Let's go ahead and see what active agents we have. Okay, cool. So here we have an agent of a given name. Last seen a few seconds ago. It's been operating on our Ubuntu Target 1 host for about an hour, and it's running as Python 3. Okay, great. We're test. This is the internal IP. Great. So I know that we're on one host right now. This is the target server that we saw in the opening diagram. Feeling good about that. Let's go ahead and see what has happened in terms of commands getting executed on this server. And with that, we can go to the reporting tab. So here we can see who did what when. And we see that we have a couple different things that have happened about an hour ago. So first we see, okay, we did have a separate agent that was first checked in and then told to download and execute something as the test123 user. So going back to that user we disabled to start with, maybe that was me testing before I recorded this video. And then we see the Empire admin user going ahead and interacting with this agent again, just trying to get a process listing, and then suddenly new agent checking in. Nothing super crazy going on, but this is a good way to just kind of see, okay, what's already been done before I go and start executing commands that may be noisy or redundant, or maybe someone has a file that I was going to download that's already stored offline. If someone's already grabbed Etsy Shadow or has already prevessed or has already done some things, I want to make sure that I have situational awareness of that, so we don't keep executing the same commands a bunch of times and increasing our footprint during the engagement. So again, you can see different users that are available, or excuse me, that are active on this server. One thing to note is that from this pane, you don't know if they're enabled or disabled. So from our non-admin client view, we see nothing other than test123 exists, and the last time that they logged on was 14 minutes ago, which actually I think is a bug because that's when we actually disabled the account. But going forward from there, we can see any additional plugins available, and then also going to settings, updating our password, chat widget, dark mode, etc., and then the good old about page for a little bit of information about the Starkiller project. So feeling good about that. One thing to note too on the settings page that I forgot to show is that if we want to log into a different server, I don't believe currently from my testing that this supports multiple server login, so you do need to log out and then connect to a new server. So with that being said, let's go ahead and before we interact with our existing agent on the target server, let's go ahead and set up a local server on the command line so that way we can create a nice little bash one-liner to execute on the Ubuntu target to then give us a new agent calling back to our second server, which is going to be the 192.168.122.21 server. Alright, so we're still on the 192.168.122.21 client as hacker2, and let's go ahead and set up a Empire server on the command line and go ahead and actually set up a listener, and then we'll have the existing agent go ahead and execute a curl command to download and execute our stager, and then we'll have two agents on our Ubuntu target host. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch over here to my terminal, make this a little bit bigger, and there we go. One more for good measure. Okay, so I already went ahead and launched it on the command line, and I say it, I mean the Empire server and the client. And if you're looking how to do that, go ahead and reference our first video on the quick start guide for Empire. So with this, we see that we don't have any listeners currently active, and there's no agents calling back as one would expect. So I'm going to go ahead and type in use listener, and remember, tab is our friend, and I just want to use a basic HTTP listener for right now. So let's go ahead and click enter, and then we'll be driven to the menu for our HTTP listener, and there's a couple things that we have to specify here. One is going to be the port, which by default won't be filled out. I've already gone ahead and did a dry run of this, so I do have it already populated with 6443. Additionally, you can specify a separate name for the listener, just so you can kind of remember if you have multiple listeners going on, why there might be one over the other. So I'm going to go ahead and actually do set name to be HTTP. Since we're using the 6443 port, I'm just going to say Kates, just because, that's the default port for the API server for Kubernetes. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and type in generate. So with this, it goes and starts our listener on the given port, or it would fail if we didn't have appropriate permissions or if there was a binding conflict for a given port. So let me go ahead and type back, and I'll go ahead and type in listeners, and sure enough, we see we have one listener of the name HTTP Kates. I have just the HTTP module, and it is enabled as of 15 seconds ago. That feels great. Now we're going to go ahead and get a stager that will be combined with what to call back to in terms of the listener. So if I go ahead and do use stager, then we get another drop-down menu of what to pick from. Obviously, the Windows commands are not going to work for our Ubuntu host, so we're going to go ahead and use a multi-bash stager. And if I go ahead and just do -H, you can see the author of this is actually Harmjoy, a little description of it, and basically it's a self-deleting bash script to execute the Stage 0 launcher. So with this, you can go ahead and specify the out file. So I want to go ahead and just make this called temp.bash. You can specify safety checks, meaning, hey, is a given process running, or am I running in a sandbox before we go ahead and execute. By default, this is set to true. But the biggest thing to kind of worry about here is making sure that the listener is tied to the listener that you expect it to, or you might have some weird mismatch issues later down the lines. So I'm going to go ahead and, also you can go ahead and specify user agent to be here. I'm just going to go ahead and go with the default one, but by all means, that's a whole other thing to dive into if you're trying to do something that's a little bit more blending in with the environment. So I'm going to go ahead and type generate, and we had an error because listener HTTP does not exist, but what does exist is HTTP Kates. So if I go ahead and update that and then type generate, huzzah, we have our temp.bash written to this given file path. So one thing that is confusing to people that are new to Empire is that Empire itself does not have any kind of built-in hosting for the payloads. So you have to go ahead and then set that up on whatever you're going to use for staging. I like to use just a simple Python 3 simple HTTP server. So I'm going to go ahead and switch on over here. And we see I went ahead and just did the sudo python 3-m HTTP server, and that just creates a simple HTTP server listening on port 8000, and that's in the directory that our stager was written to. So now I've gone ahead and created a listener, created a stager associated with that listener, and I'm currently hosting it with a simple HTTP server. So I can go back to Starkiller and then execute a curl one-liner on that existing agent to get a new agent to call back to this server. So that way we'll have two agents going on our target Ubuntu host, however they'll be calling back to different servers. Let's go ahead and pop back over to the Starkiller interface and do that. So here we see the agent, and we're going to go ahead and just give this a quick refresh. Yep, last seen a few seconds ago. Okay, the agent hasn't gone stale. It's been checking in, no one's killed it or the server hasn't rebooted or anything like that. I'm going to go ahead and click pop out here. So what this is going to do is give me a nice little shell command or a module that I can run on the agent. And what I'm going to do here is just do curl, and I'm going to type in the IP address of our current server. And I'm listening on port 8000, and I called it temp.bash, and we're going to pipe that to bash. So we're going to go ahead and fetch our bash payload, pipe to bash, and then I should see a new agent call in. So I'm going to go ahead and hit run, shell command queued, pop on over to tasks. We can see Hacker2 just went ahead and scheduled this, and this can give us a little bit more information about the target, basically the same information that we're seeing here. So I'm going to go ahead and click out of here and go to just the reporting. And again, this is just showing us, hey, a few seconds ago, this was executed by this user against this agent. So let me go ahead and shift back to our terminal, and we should actually see by now the callback and a new agent spawn on our local server. And sure enough, hey, we have a new agent. So I'm going to go ahead and do main, and we see we have one currently active agent. And sure enough, the internal IP is that Ubuntu target host. It's calling back to our Kate's listener, and I can go ahead and interact with this new agent, get a process listing, and go from there. So in this period of this video, we've gone ahead and created a new user, used that user to interact with an existing session, to spawn their own session. Maybe we have different malleable C2 profiles, maybe we have different jitter for the agent to call back to. Maybe we're trying different techniques that might be more risky, so we don't want to burn one of the C2 hosts. There's a bunch of reasons why you might do this. Maybe you're just at CCDC, ISTS, IRSec, some attack defend competition, and you have a bunch of red teamers that want to share some infrastructure. Here's a great way to get started. But with that, we're going to go ahead and conclude today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. That helps a bunch. Comment below. I do respond to the comments. And again, from my lab to yours, ArchCloud Labs.